what would happen if every human being on Earth disappeared. This isn't the story of how we might vanish. It is the story of what happens to the world we leave behind. In this episode of Life After People, man harnessed dangerous substances to dominate the world, but he was playing with fire. A common chemical turns into a cloud of death. A spontaneous explosion rocks New York City. And power plants find a secret way to go nuclear. Welcome to Earth. Population zero. Man may be gone, but the world will now face an assault from the toxic chemicals and deadly substances he left behind. One day after people, nuclear reactors across the world begin shutting down into safe mode.
When you lose power from outside the reactor, the safety systems are designed so it tries to shut down the core.
A mechanical system automatically engages to halt the nuclear reactions. The uranium used for fuel in these plants is naturally radioactive, meaning it releases energetic particles as it decays. And there's more uranium at a nuclear plant than just what's in the reactors. Every 18 months, uranium in the core stops producing enough energy to sustain a nuclear reaction and has to be replaced. At that point, the fuel is dangerously hot.
When they pull the fuel from the reactor core, that's when it becomes radioactive waste. It's thousands of times hotter than when you put it into the core, thermally and radioactively. So you then take that fuel and you put it in the fuel pools to keep it cool.
Freshly removed fuel rods can reach a scalding 2,000 degrees. And it takes 40 feet of water maintained below 120 degrees to keep them from overheating.
The amount of waste in the pool depends on how long the reactor is operated. The reactors here in the US have been operating between 30 to 40 years at this point. So you have 5 to 10 times the amount of radiation in the spent fuel pool that you actually have in the core of the reactor.
The cooling pool may look harmless, but danger is simmering just beneath the surface. Another threat looms at rail yards like these, where train cars wait for engines that will never arrive. In the time of humans, 31 million cars carried 2 million tons of cargo. And 40,000 of these cars carry a common chemical that can be lethal if accidentally unleashed. Now, without people, it's waiting silently for the time to strike. Five days after people, one of man's toxic leftovers is already ravaging the planet. Raw sewage. Millions of gallons are flowing into the rivers around Manhattan. As electricity shuts off, 93 pump stations around the city are failing one by one. Sewage is backing up and flooding the 6,000 miles of piping beneath New York. This happened before, during the Northeast blackout of 2003.
When the power went out, the sewage system could not pump all of the water through the sewage treatment plant. As a result, water went right out into the Hudson.
500 million gallons of raw sewage overwhelmed pipes and spilled out into New York's waterways. Left unchecked, sewage produces methane gas, a nasty byproduct of decaying organic matter. And it's now finding its way into the city's rail and subway tunnels.
All of the tunnels are interconnected. They're interconnected with each other, and they're interconnected with the sewer lines of the city.
Lighter than air, methane naturally seeks the highest tunnels as it creeps below street level. The ultimate destination for much of the methane gas is the area around Grand Central Terminal, because it sits on one of the highest natural points in Manhattan.
Because Grand Central Terminal is such a high point, after people, one of the dangers is collection of gas, especially during the spring when there's a lot of water, a lot of bacterial growth. So you will get small amounts of gas collecting naturally in the platform area and in the terminal itself.
Ventilation intakes inside the terminal would normally clear the air of dangerous fumes. But without power, those aren't working anymore. And wherever flammable methane flows unchecked, the risk of an explosion follows.
You should really think of the city as a machine, not as a pile of static structures. And that machine is in mortal danger once the people leave.
One week after people, the stench from garbage left behind by people is a sure sign of a delicious meal for this nocturnal rodent.
Raccoons are really attracted to things that smell really bad. Something that would repel people is an attractant for raccoons.
The average raccoon weighs about 15 pounds, but those with easy access to human scraps can balloon to over 60 pounds.
The raccoon is the ultimate omnivore. Basically, they'll eat anything.
Without people, raccoons are continuing to exploit the structures that resemble their natural habitats the most.
Our chimneys function a lot like hollow trees. That's actually one of the favorite refuges for raccoons. And so they can easily climb up the outside of a chimney and then come down through the bottom.
Raccoons seek interiors because they offer protection from weather and predators. But nothing beats the allure of free food.
That sense of smell is going to draw them into the kitchen and any other place where they have garbage in the house.
For a raccoon, this is heaven on earth. A very highly developed sense of touch means that their long fingers and toes are a raccoon's point of first contact.
Their brain is connected to their feet, basically. They forage with their feet or their hands instead of with their nose and with their eyesight like a lot of other carnivores. They can open up cabinets. They can open up your refrigerator. They devastate the kitchen. They devastate it.
For these masked little bandits, the shoplifting has never been easier.
They'll literally simply walk from their den site to that refuse site and eat, get a little bit to drink, and simply walk right back and go back to sleep. And that's pretty much it. Actually, they become couch potatoes very quickly.
"10 days after people, discarded fuel rods are primed for a toxic reawakening. In the time of humans, spent fuel rods were kept below water for up to 10 years before they were cool enough to be removed safely. But now, with power lost to the cooling pools, heat from the rods is causing the water to boil away. Once the water level dips below the tops of the rods and their temperature hits 700 degrees, the entire pool becomes a bonfire.
And that would help propel all the radiation, 10, 20 cores worth, that are sitting in those spent fuel pools out into the environment. To whichever way the wind blew, those are the areas you'd be contaminating.
An invisible killer has been unleashed, and nothing is safe for miles in each direction. One month after people, Niagara Falls. The 170-plus foot drops on the American and Canadian side of the Niagara River continue to put on their spectacular show. Although once a destination for honeymooners and family outings, Niagara Falls also conceals a toxic secret. One month after people, 1.5 million gallons of water continue to gush over Niagara Falls each second. But this awesome natural wonder is hiding a very unnatural past.
One of the surprising things about the Niagara region is that it was always very industrialized. One of the signs that you see is a large number of landfills.
Perhaps the most lethal is the one at Love Canal, where 20,000 tons of toxic waste lie buried.
A hazardous waste landfill is lined usually with plastic or with cement. The fluids that leak out are constantly monitored, and leaks are adjusted and corrected and repaired. In a life after people, none of that is going to be happening.
But it's not the small leaks of toxins that will cause the most damage. It's the massive surges of water that are about to wreak havoc on Niagara Falls. In the time of humans, the region attracted heavy industry because of access to inexpensive hydroelectric power. 1 month after people, a pair of plants 7 miles from the falls are still generating electricity.
Hydroelectric plants don't require humans to load the fuel into the plant the way, say, a coal plant requires humans to load the coal in. So the water would continue to flow into the plant and would continue to spin the turbines, even without people there running it.
Enormous intake tunnels continue to draw water into the turbines and divert it away from the falls. But that's about to change.
In a life after people, there won't be people using electricity, so there won't be a need for electricity. The substations that accept the electricity coming from the Niagara power plants will then speak back to the power plant and say, don't send me any more power. And Niagara would automatically begin to shut down.
As the plants turn off, the intake tunnels close.
The tunnels will no longer be pulling water out of the river, and that will be a very interesting moment.
The river rises 13 feet almost instantly and doubles the flow of water over the falls. Downstream, the Maid of the Mist docks, the launch point for up-close views of the falls for over 150 years, gets blasted away. 2 months after people. The free ride for urban raccoons is coming to an end. Trash cans aren't providing the bounty they've grown used to. But access to water is keeping some raccoons close to abandoned homes. Domestic gardens also provide a lifeline.
They do take advantage of the fruits quite a bit. So that would continue for some period in time, but that probably isn't not enough to sustain them over the long haul.
Raccoons moved into cities in the early 1900s as they discovered the good life near people. In peak conditions, 1 square mile of urban space can support over 200 raccoons. But without the bounty supplied by people, fewer than 1 in 10 urban raccoons will survive even a year.
So they're going to have to start looking and actually working for their food, which means chasing their prey. They're going to eat clams, crayfish, that type of thing. So they will go back to eating the things that they're really supposed to be eating anyway.
It's no longer a picnic, but after a massive die-off, the species will survive. One year after people, at nuclear plants where overheated fuel rods burst into flames, miles-wide dead zones leave a scar. A radiated ring of death already happened once in the time of people. It was caused by a malfunctioning nuclear reactor at Chernobyl in the former Soviet Union. Radiation decimated pine forests within a 2-mile radius. This is the damage wrought by the failure of just one power plant. In a life after people, there are hundreds of sites where spent fuel rods will unleash their deadly radiation.
What you're looking at are 440 commercial reactor sites plus the military sites that would become basically irradiated dead zones.
Five years after people, an abandoned freighter still plies the waters of the Great Lakes. In the time of humans, vessels of all types shuttled 162 million tons of cargo through the region each year.
There are a lot of ships on the Great Lakes. These are very large tankers. They are up to 1,000 feet long.
And all vessels still floating on the Great Lakes are headed in the same direction: Niagara Falls.
The falls are almost like a bathtub drain. They're pulling all of the water out of the Great Lakes through and into Lake Ontario and ultimately out to sea. So everything that's in the Great Lakes is moving towards Niagara Falls.
However, the International Railway Bridge near the entrance to the Niagara River bars the way. No ship taller than 22 feet can pass underneath. The bridge, built in 1873, is holding for now. But more ships are on the way. A decade into a life after people, Grand Central Terminal, once visited daily by 500,000 people, now is just a gathering place for owls. Methane gas has been building up in the rail tunnels below, but it's not Grand Central that's in the most danger. That's because the tracks don't actually run under the building.
The tracks are under the MetLife building, but they're beside Grand Central Terminal. People don't realize the original railroad terminology. A terminal is where tracks end.
tunnels below the MetLife building next door, other toxic fumes are mixing with the methane.
There are a lot of volatile materials. There's a fair amount of oil and residue on the tracks below. These areas are very well maintained right now, but after people, you're going to see a fair amount of kerosene fumes, gasoline fumes, alcohol fumes, all the cleaning materials that are used to keep the tunnel dust-free and grease-free. And all of these things are in metal cans. The metal cans are subject to corrosion.
Sitting over the tunnels, the MetLife building is absorbing a dangerous cocktail of gases.
Volatile material itself, in the presence of oxygen, begins to oxidize and heat up, and at some point explodes into fire.
A ball of flame erupts from below and shatters the silence of the abandoned city. "20 years after people, there's a logjam at the International Railway Bridge made up of giant ships. But it's not only the boats bearing down.
In most winters, Lake Erie freezes. Typically, 2% of that ice works its way towards the upper Niagara. Now, that's 200 square miles of ice wanting to go down the river and find its way to Lake Ontario.
In the time of humans, a boom laid out on the lake every December blocked ice from colliding with the bridge. So far, it's lasted 20 years without help from people.
Can it stand forever? I would say no, and the reason is ice coming off of Lake Erie. There's no boom anymore after people to stop it or deflect it.
In 1938, the so-called Honeymoon Bridge over the Niagara River collapsed after a 100-foot-high ice jam plowed into it. Now, the railway bridge collapses under the pressure. Massive ghost ships begin a new voyage. And the way to Niagara Falls, just 20 miles downstream, is wide open. In the decades ahead, some areas will be visited by 3 forms of toxic revenge. In this American town, it's a future that's already happened. "40 years after people, a toxic wind blows through the abandoned streets of Middle America. It's a future that's already happened here in Pitcher, Oklahoma, the most toxic town in America. The residents were evicted not by 1, but 3 forms of toxic revenge, all caused by the very thing that built this town, mining. Pitcher, Oklahoma was once at the center of the largest lead and zinc deposit in the world. Now, all that remains is poison that can't be removed and a land that can't be fixed. Things were different in the first half of the 20th century. As the world plunged into 2 world wars, tanks, guns, and ammunition created a huge appetite for lead. But the wars ended, and in the 1950s and 60s, the mines shut down, one by one. The last closed in 1970.
It was a one-commodity town. They were based upon lead and zinc. So like in other industrial towns, once that goes away, the population decreases.
As many as 30,000 citizens filled Pitcher at its height. Now, it's almost entirely abandoned. Only a few dozen souls remain.
Pitcher was a lot like a lot of small towns in the middle part of America. You know, these were hardworking folks. They had a mining history. The salt of the earth folks you hear about. They raised their families and they made do.
While the mine closings drove some of the residents away, it was what the mines left behind that killed the town for good. Mountainous gravel mounds known as chat piles are one form of toxic revenge.
The chat pile is the material that was left over after the minerals were processed, so it's a gravel-like substance. The material that was recoverable was taken. This was the waste. No use for it. It sat on the surface for the better part of a century.
The chat piles contain toxic doses of lead, zinc, and other metals. Gusty winds blowing over the plains of the Midwestern United States scattered dust off the 75 million tons of noxious gravel piled up here. One of the casualties was this Little League baseball field, still in use for years, even as citizens fled from Pitcher.
Kids came out here to play. You know, everybody was using it. You know, it's just kind of a playground. Picnic tables, you could go have a picnic over there. This was just a hangout.
And now, a dozen years after people, a tree claims the Pitcher's Mound. And native prairie grass, displaced for decades, is returning.
The seeds for the old prairie are still in the dirt. That doesn't go away. You can burn it, you can till it. Those seeds will always be there. And if you give them the right conditions, you know, they're gonna come back.
Pitcher's Main Street has been abandoned for more than 30 years. It wasn't closed by poison dust wafting from chat piles. It was another form of toxic revenge, the underground void created by the removal of all that rock.
Main Street initially was shut down because of a collapse. The ground gave in over on the left side of the street.
In the process of digging an estimated 300 miles of tunnels, miners had removed so much of the rock and soil beneath Main Street that sinkholes had started forming and swallowing parts of Pitcher.
Some of these underground workings were 100 feet from floor to ceiling.
They mined too close to the surface in a lot of areas. In some areas, they mined all the way up to the tree roots. This area could cave in any time.
Grass now springs over the pavement where miners and their families once looked for supplies, and where shopkeepers once welcomed patrons. Saplings now stand guard.
There was a Sears over here. There was a J.C. Penney's, you know, over there. Trading post, hardware store. This is where you came to get, you know, what you needed, even if it was a drink or if it was a shirt, you know, or a new pair of boots. You know, you had it pretty much all right here. You didn't have to go anywhere else.
It's all still on display. A pair of shoes, magazines, and supplies. Antiquated cash registers still stand by, waiting for customers that will never show. It wasn't until 10 years after the last mines closed that the underground caverns opened up by mining delivered a third toxic shock to Pitcher. Poisoned groundwater. To reach the underground deposits, miners had to puncture a natural groundwater reservoir.
During mining operations, they pumped about 55 million gallons a day of water out of the underground workings. Once mining ceased, they shut those pumps off, and natural groundwater began to fill the mines.
It's coming literally out of the mine shafts because the aquifer here is what they were mining in.
By some estimates, there's enough polluted water below ground to fill over 1 million residential swimming pools.
We'd be hard-pressed to find another human activity that causes quite as much damage as mining can. And we open up the earth, remove what we want, and leave it when we're finished. And that's what's happened here.
Mines built the town. But toxic water, waste piles, and sinkholes destroyed it.
The lead was used to bomb Germany and Japan. You know, what can you say? You know, what we use to destroy those places destroyed this place, and it's destroyed today.
The destruction continues in a life after people as toxic revenge spreads around the planet. Soon, more than water will be falling over this natural wonder. 5 decades into a life after people. Train cars loaded with cargo are deteriorating. Some of them carry chlorine. It was used for disinfecting drinking water and swimming pools, and manufacturing plastics. But chlorine can be deadly. And these aging rail cars aren't heavily armored. The outer steel shell is only 1/10 of an inch thick. The insulation is 4 inches of plastic.
Half of them are already over 20 years old with a life expectancy of about 50 years. That assumes, of course, that they're constantly inspected, they're constantly maintained and cleaned.
Weakened by corrosion, the undercarriage gives way.
Most of that car empties in a matter of less than an hour. And that means that the cloud of chlorine would be very, very dense and therefore extremely deadly.
Heavier than air, chlorine gas advances over ground like a killer fog.
Immediately, instantaneously, can't keep your eyes open and you can't breathe any longer. And of course, wildlife would have no clue.
And if chlorine gas touches water, on a tree, in a lake, or even on an animal, it immediately turns into acid.
And it would continue to acidify that water and not only kill the fish and turtles and other vegetation in the water, but probably result in a long-term death of that system and the aquatic life in it.
In 2005, a rail accident in Graniteville, South Carolina, released 90 tons of chlorine gas into the environment, about half the carrying car's capacity. 9 people died, and another 250 had to be treated for chlorine exposure. Hazmat crews needed 2 weeks to decontaminate a 1-mile radius around the site.
The gas was only, again, partially released, and it wasn't in a populated area. Even those that survived were horrified.
Without people to maintain the rail cars, these deadly fogs will continue to be unleashed around the world. "60 years after people, A freighter grounded in the Niagara River is leaking iron ore, releasing a red stain into the water. In the time of humans, no commodity was carried over the Great Lakes more than iron ore. These largest ships, known as Lakers, can hold 75,000 tons. But they also draw more than 30 feet of water when afloat. That's too deep for sections of the Niagara River near the falls. But another Laker is working its way toward the falls. This one is not getting caught along the shallows.
The ones most likely to make it towards the lip of the Niagara Falls are ships riding high, like this one, out of ballast and carrying no cargo. That means they're hardly drawing any water, maybe 5 or 10 feet.
It approaches Niagara Falls, once a gathering spot for newlyweds. For this ship, the honeymoon is over.
They're not armored, they're not like a battleship. In fact, the shells are quite thin, like an eggshell, half-inch, couple inches, depending on the size of the ship.
As it reaches the edge, the front half shears off and tumbles. The back follows. Incredibly, the 200-foot ship is actually longer than the falls is high. 350 miles to the south, the MetLife building is also falling to pieces. When it opened in 1963, the building's 58 floors meant it stood as the 7th tallest in the United States. But it will soon give up its place on Park Avenue.
Because it's built in a rather exposed area, it's going to get more wind, it's going to get more rain than a typical New York City skyscraper.
Already weakened by the methane explosion at its base, 6 decades of neglect have also assaulted the building's steel and glass facade.
Death will come a piece at a time as sections of the framework peel away.
This means the neighboring Grand Central building is in the line of fire.
Grand Central Terminal has a near mortal enemy right next door. And I certainly expect to see sections of the facade of the MetLife building actually falling onto the roof.
As glass and steel rain down, has Grand Central Terminal reached the end of the line? 150 years after people. In New York City, the MetLife building, after enduring a gas fire and shedding steel from its top floors for decades, finally breaks. A giant section falls southward, tumbling onto the roof of Grand Central Terminal. Despite the attack from the MetLife building, Grand Central's 4 granite walls still stand.
The outside walls are actually very thick granite. They hold themselves up. The granite itself is the structure of the building. Here you have a building, Grand Central Terminal, that was more than 50 years old when the MetLife building, originally the Pan Am building, was built next to it. And yet, even with that head start on aging, Grand Central Terminal will still be recognizable as a building 250 years, maybe even 500 years after people.
"175 years after people." At nuclear power plants around the world, fires in the spent fuel pools burned out long ago. Still looming over these sites, are the iconic cooling towers that symbolized mankind's mastery over the atom. Plant life clings to the rusting steel lattice frame that surrounds the concrete.
Many nuclear plants are in agricultural areas. You're going to get a lot of blowing soil and seeds coming in there very quickly.
A steel lattice ring at the base supports the weight of the 500-foot-high concrete structure. But it doesn't have any strength left.
As soon as a structure of this type begins to fail, it fails spectacularly. The ring would tilt and the tower would slide right off the ring and collapse in a heap. It would not come down vertically, it would slide and tip and fail.
Man's once mighty power plants of the future are now reduced to rubble. 1,500 years after people, the American side of Niagara Falls is undergoing a dramatic transformation. For centuries, the Niagara River split at Goat Island, creating cascades over two brinks. The American Falls and the Horseshoe Falls on the Canadian side.
Like all waterfalls, Niagara Falls is really not a thing. It's an event. It's water flowing over a series of brinks that are eventually moving backwards.
As water cascades over a fall, it's eroding the rock beneath and moving its brink upstream.
About 900 years ago, there was a single waterfall that went across like this. And because there is actually a double channel above, about 90% of the flow of the water came over this side, the Canadian Falls.
In the time of humans, the Horseshoe Falls eroded backward about a foot a year. And because much more water gushed over the Horseshoe Falls, that side eroded much faster than the American side. After people, the Horseshoe Falls are moving backward even faster, nearly 6 feet every year, because there are no longer any power plants to divert water from the falls.
Once the Horseshoe erodes upstream of Goat Island, you'll no longer have any water at all going over the American Falls.
For the American Falls, life after people will be a life after water. Earth moves on in timescales too large for man to have ever truly comprehended. Mankind's toxic legacy lessens with every passing year. Buried in the silt, covered over by grass and trees, and carried away by the tide in a life after people.